Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Mathematica. It's great to see so many of you here in person, and I know we have many more who have joined us online as well. I'm Paul Decker, and for the last 31 years, I've been very proud to work with the talented staff that we have here at Mathematica, including the last 13 years as president and CEO. When I began my career, Mathematica had a well-earned reputation as a pioneer in policy research and evaluation. After all, we helped invent the field. When Mathematica was created, we were created to administer and to assess the New Jersey negative income tax experiment, which was the first large-scale social policy experiment in the US. Subsequent to that, if you wanted to work on big projects and have big impacts, you wouldn't and still can't find a better place to do that than at Mathematica. Back then, when people asked me what I did and what Mathematica was, the answer was simple. I was a researcher, and Mathematica conducted policy research to improve public well-being. Today, the answer tends to be a bit more complex, and if you've attended our events before, you may notice that things look a little different than they have in the past. And that's no accident. That's a reflection that today's Mathematica includes researchers like me, but we're also driven by the talent and expertise of economists, data scientists, educators, technology developers, clinicians, statisticians, policy experts, survey specialists, storytellers, and collaborators. Today, we don't just collect and analyze data. We work hand in hand with our partners to improve programs, refine strategies, and enhance understanding. And so today we're kicking off a different kind of conversation around the challenges of becoming data-driven and how organizations can take their first or their next steps toward the better use of data to chart progress together. This is the first in a series of in-person and online conversations throughout 2019 and beyond that's dedicated to this topic. The promise seems simple. Data aren't only relevant for academic research. Consumers use data every day when making decisions about buying household goods, booking hotels, or choosing where to eat. Businesses use data in real time to determine the ads we see, the best locations for expansion, or the cost of their services. But using data to drive decisions about social programs continues to remain out of reach for many policymakers and program administrators at all levels of government. The stakes are high, the data are messy, the systems are old, but the pressure is on. And too many conversations about the promise of using data to drive decisions lead with new steps, new requirements, new staff, and new expectations that are simply out of reach for too many. It doesn't have to be that way. And so for today's kickoff conversation, we've brought together leaders from across a variety of sectors who understand the complexities of government data systems and the particular privacy requirements of working within the public sector. People who know that the biggest hurdle to becoming data-driven is often just getting started. And people that, no matter where you are on your journey, have been there before and can offer the insights and expertise you need to become more data-driven yourself. Please join me in welcoming the panel today. Beginning on my right, we have Veronica Olafable, who's the Director of Measurement, Evaluation, and Organizational Performance at the Rockefeller Foundation. Veronica is an award-winning data and analytics enthusiast who serves on the American Evaluation Association's Board of Directors. Next in the line is Clarence Wardell. Clarence is the Director of City Solutions at Results for America, where he supports the What Works Cities initiative to help mid-sized cities use data and evidence to guide programming and investment decisions. He's a former member of the U.S. Digital Service and also served as a Presidential Innovation Fellow. Next is Christina Becker. Christina is a Health Policy and Program Associate at the American Public Human Services Association, where she is deeply involved in the National Collaborative for Integration of Health and Human Services and serves as chair of the Collaborative's Analytics Committee. Finally, Connor Norwood is the Chief Data Officer for the Indiana Family and Social Services Administration, and he oversees the agency's enterprise data warehouse, which houses the data required to support the reporting, business intelligence, and advanced analytics for Indiana's health and human services programs. We're going to spend most of our time today in a conversation that I will moderate among this group, but I assure you that we will open up the floor for questions before the end of the session and give you time for questions, both for the in-house audience as well as the online audience. So let me go ahead and get the conversation rolling. And I want to start, in a way, at the beginning. I'm sorry, start at the end. Getting tougher. And that is, I want to find out how we define what it is to be data-driven. So how will we know it when we see it? What does it look like at an organizational level? Connor, perhaps you can get us started on how would you define being data-driven?
So I think, well, thanks to Paul and Mathematica for having me. I'm happy to be here, and I think this is a really important conversation that I'm glad to be a part of. So I had a kind of unique career path to get where I was or where I am today. I actually started out in academia and went that whole path, and then finally decided maybe I don't want to sit in the ivory tower writing these papers. You're judged on citations, and then you're chasing grants and soft money. And so I reached out to Secretary Walthall, who I had worked with in a couple different capacities, and was able to say, hey, what do you got? How do I transition to something else, something different? And she said, why don't you come and run data for us here at Family Social Services Administration? I said, great. I have no idea what I'm getting myself into, but perfect, let's do it. The reason why I say this is because I can tell you what I think being data-driven is not, which is kind of a little bit of what I walked into, where as a researcher, I'm like, great, I have access to all the data in the world. This is like a researcher's dream. And I quickly realized I have access to no data. And that was for a variety of reasons. It was due to our analytical tools, our infrastructure. We have hundreds and even thousands of reports that we generate. And so what I believe being data-driven is not is reports, right? We generate a lot of information, but is it the right information? And is it actually answering the questions, not counts or not how many people did this happen to, but why are things happening, and how can that actually inform a discussion to make a better decision than we could without these pieces of information. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but I think it's more reports does not make a data-driven culture.
Good afternoon, everyone. Very happy to be here. So I don't have a data science research background, so I like to think about what it means to be data-driven or data-informed. I'm sure we'll get into that conversation later around the language, but I like to think about, really simply, and that's just Health and Human Services Agency being able to put data in front of people when they need it, and that can be the client or the caseworker, in a way that's easy to understand, right? That could be dashboards, that could be maybe not a report. I was going to say an easy to read report, but maybe not. And you want to try, the North Star would be to have that data in front of you as you're trying to make decisions. So not after the fact, but if you've got the caseworker there, that they're able to look at something like a dashboard and they're able to tailor something to the client right then and there. So like at the data level, that would be, at the organizational level, that would mean that you're able to target interventions for your client. You're hopefully addressing structural inequities, and you're hopefully down the line helping to reduce costs.
I'm next.
Yes, sorry.
All right. No, that's good. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. Not a ton more to add. Maybe a slightly different view or spin on that is I think for me a data-driven organization is really a curious organization, right? And so it's less about starting with the data from my perspective, but more about what questions are we trying to answer? Do we care about how well we're serving people? Do we care about how well the programs that we're investing resources into are performing? And from there, the only way you can answer a lot of those questions is about the data. Then do you have the systems and the processes in place that allow you to answer those questions in a cogent way? And then on top of that, I think, and where we spend a lot of time on the What Works Cities work, is we work a lot with chief executives, and at the local level, those are mayors, right? And so do you have a chief executive that cares about data, right? Or that we'll be curious and we'll ask those questions. Sounds like you walked into a situation where you knew that you were working with someone, who cared. And our belief is that that permeates down into the organization, right? Not only if you have a chief executive that is willing to show that him or her cares about what does the data say, what does the information say, what are people saying about our services and about how we're serving them. For me, that's, yes, you need all the processes, you need the technical infrastructure, but to Connor's point, that doesn't make a data-driven organization. I think it's the people and the leadership.
I'm up. So not that much to add. I'm really thinking from a philanthropic perspective. We're an organization that's been around for about 106 years. We started the field of philanthropy in the US, and many times when many people, organizations, partners come to us, they believe that we must be a data-driven organization, that we have 106 years of digitized data somewhere, which we do. Most of it is in PDFs. And so I often have found that really we're talking about the theory of being data-driven, that having the systems and processes and the people all in place to make data-driven decisions at the right time in a cost-effective way it is very theoretical, and no one has figured it out just yet. There are very good illustrative examples out there. We can get into the conversation about data-driven and the pluses and minuses of that, as well as being data-informed. But really, I think that it's an aspiration, and that there is an urgency to figuring that out now, given all of the shifts and changes that are happening in the world around data and technology. And so now is the time to figure it out.
So Clarence, let me pick up on an aspect of your comments, which is the starting point, which is an organization or set of individuals or an individual who's curious. So let's say I have somebody like that, for example, the chief executive of a city, and they've heard that they need to be more data-driven. How do they get that process started? What do you tell them about, take this step first?
Yeah. That's a good question. I think, for me, part of it's, how do you build a team that has the skill set and has kind of that same curiosity level that you do. I think, in the work that we do with cities, one of the things that we launched about 2 years ago now as part of What Works Cities is called the What Works Cities Certification Standard. And really, it's our proxy for what is a well-managed, data-driven city government, right? And we've went through the whole list, and we have 45 criteria that we evaluate cities on. Some are really complex, and some are pretty basic. And when I think about some of the basic ones, it starts with, just building a data inventory, right? So first principles, like what data do we have around here, right? So that's on the one hand of like what assets do we have. If you get to the other side, though, I think it's starting to organize like what are our, and this isn't a data question, what are our priorities as a city? And are we achieving those, right? And I think even if you just ask those two questions, right, that's going to start to lead you down a path where you can only really answer that if you start to bring data into the conversation, right? And so when we work with cities on building out performance management processes, or like your comp stat processes traditionally, but other stat processes around homelessness, child welfare, and other things, that's where it starts. It starts with what are your priorities, what are the things you're trying to achieve, what are the key results and metrics that we can track along the way that makes us that we can be confident that we're heading in the right direction. If we're not, we can make adjustments there. So those are things that you can answer. You don't have to have a PhD in economics. You don't have to have a data science degree. I mean, those are things that anybody who's running an organization, you should know why you're there and what outcomes you're trying to achieve. And so I think those are, from our perspective, that's one of the first steps you should be taking before you run out to procure some fancy system to collect and store your data.
And if I can piggyback off on that a little bit, so from my perspective, I think that is 100%. I've seen it, and I've lived it the last 12 months. So our agency actually, right when I came on, I asked the secretary, I said, so do we have a strategic plan? Because I wanted to create those priorities for my group and match it to the agency. We didn't have one that had been updated within the last 10 years, and she had planned, and we have now done so. We've completely redone the vision, the mission, and the values of the agency. The original vision statement was very transactional. It was very, we're going to adjudicate Medicaid claims. We're going to be cost effective. We're going to, do all that stuff. It was very long. The new vision is very concise, very short, and it connects us to the purpose of why we're there as an agency, which now each of the divisions within the agency have started to redo their vision and mission to align with that, which then allows us to think about what the strategic priorities are for the data roadmap on how do we use this to accomplish those goals. But really thinking about the end users, the constituents we serve, and why we're really here as an agency has made it easier to use data effectively.
And I was talking to a state recently, and they've done, I think, something really cool, and they've done some really deep, serious, like human-centered design research. And so they've done all of these focus groups with their actual families and the actual customers that they're serving and their community to really figure out what it is that they need. Because obviously a human services agency, you're in this to help make outcomes better, right? So if you can ask your customers, what do you think we need to do going forward, right? Because you're asking, where does an agency even start? I promise you, families on the ground have an idea where the human services agency can get better and where they could start. So I thought that was a really unique approach to it.
Start out with curiosity.
Yeah.
Start out with what you care about. Start out with priorities, a discussion around the priorities.
And we've used this phrase, building a culture of inquiry, right? So once you connect yourself to the purpose and you really understand why you're there, you have to start investing in getting everybody to really have that curiosity and want to inquire about why things are happening so we can get better and get closer to our goals.
Now, as we've talked about this, prior to this conversation, we've gotten into some of the complexities that arise in this process. And so it's pretty easy, I can imagine, to get overwhelmed by the details of the process as you're working through it, and potentially get overwhelmed to the point where people walk away. What's the best advice you've received in the journey or that you give about how to see through that path forward through getting to the point of being data-driven? Anybody?
I'll take the first stab at it. I think we all come from various industries and sectors, and we have all unique perspective and experience where I think we've actually seen this. I think you just have to start with something small that's tangible that you can actually start building the value proposition of how investing in becoming data-driven can pay off in the long run to get you towards those goals. So we are working on a project right now where we're revamping, actually creating a data governance program for the first time in our specific agency. And we're using this just-in-time governance approach where we're learning and implementing things as we're working through one specific use case, where we're collaborating with the Department of Corrections. So when inmates go into when citizens go into the system, they become suspended on their Medicaid coverage. That requires data exchange, right? And then we want to get them coverage as fast as they can when they leave to reduce poor outcomes, adverse events, high cost utilization in the emergency room, recidivism back into the system. So we picked this small thing that we knew we had the governor's support, we had the commissioner of Department of Corrections and the secretary's support. So we took this that was a priority for the state and really use that to learn how we can improve data governance, data-driven decision-making, and we've started to build a real program from that one small thing, so it didn't become so overwhelming.
And I would add, the advice that I've received is share the challenge. This is not going to be solved by your chief data officer or your chief evaluation officer. It's not one person's job, it's everybody's person's job. And so very tactically, the way that plays itself out is that the data team probably needs to be reporting to the key decision maker to ensure that cultural change and all of the operational and programmatic decisions are being made through a lens of data and changing the culture. Number two, I would say, is it's really helpful when you have a data asset policy or a data governance policy of some sort. We have just, over the last year, developed one that governs the way that we think about the data that we get through most of our grantees. We're a grant-making agency, and our investees, ensuring that we're appropriate. We're, number one, capturing the data, the digital data, so we will have data in the future. coming through our pipelines, but then also ensuring that our partners are okay with possibly making some of that data open for others. And then in addition to that, really thinking about some of our principles around data. How should we be treating it from the beginning to the end? And the last thing that we've done differently is we've actually hired several data scientists. And we don't believe that the technical capacity is what's going to solve our challenge. We think that is an organizational challenge. But what we believe is that we needed to start with actually bringing in the mindset that that data scientists and data analysts bring to our problem around philanthropy.
I was just gonna, I agree with all of that. I think one other piece I want to throw in here, just because it's core to our work now. When I was at the White House, I led a large effort called the Police Data Initiative. So we worked with law enforcement agencies across the country to help move them towards more data transparency around law enforcement data. And quite frankly, then and then with the cities we work now, the biggest thing that I've seen in terms of like once you run up against kind of a roadblock and then to push through is having a peer agency or a peer in another city, right? So someone who's either struggling with the same challenge, and so you guys can kind of solve it together, or who's already seen it, right? And so the work is hard. The work is hard for a lot of the agencies and the folks within agencies that we work with. They haven't, been pushed around some of these issues before, and so I think that's a big piece to
get a little mentoring from their more experienced counterparts.
Yeah.
Christina, let me direct the next question towards you. Often, a fear I often hear when I'm outside Mathematica talking about reliance on data and evidence in a public management setting is the thought that, well, we don't want everything to be about the data and lose the insights of practitioners or frontline staff. And people are worried that data-driven means driving all that out, crowding out the judgment of people that they've traditionally thought of as experts. So I wondered if that's something you've encountered in your journey, and what are the ways in which we can, or ways in which you've addressed that issue in your conversation?
Sure, yeah. So we were talking before the panel about the difference between being data-driven and data-informed. So I'm stealing all this from Connor. But the way that he said, the data, to maybe be using the phrase data-informed is a little bit better because it gives people that empowerment to realize that data is not telling them what to do. It's just one more thing that you're considering, right? So, including other policies, including, your morality, including whatever. So, so I think that's a genuine fear that people think that just that, I would say I would equivalent this to any other piece of technology. I mean, nowadays you put anything into Google Maps, you just kind of follow it blindly, right? So it takes some staff training to understand that even though you might have this analytics tool that's telling you one thing, you don't have to necessarily follow it if your 30 years of training tell you that the child does need to be taken out of the family and placed somewhere else, right? So for me, when I hear those kinds of concerns from people, I would always think that it's kind of a change management and a staff training technique to continue telling your staff that they are valued, that they have a place in this conversation because, for example, your caseworkers are the ones collecting all of this information on the ground, and so they're actually a vital component of data-driven decision making. And so, for me, it's more of a change management and a staff piece.
I would just add on, just picking up on the data-informed piece, from an evaluation perspective, we spend a lot of time triangulating information. And so data-driven to me communicates an intentionality with getting a specific data point of some sort. And data-informed to me communicates a behavior around gathering different pieces of data. And so some of it could be through actual primary research, some of it could be through some of your monitoring and mobile data collection, and some of it is operational in-house data that you have. Even sentiment analysis and how your teams are feeling or how your partners are feeling could qualify as data. And earlier on, we were having a conversation around when we think about data, the construct that comes to our mind is something quantitative usually, and something that you get for a reason. Whereas Connor and I were having this conversation around the breadth of data. We're living in this time when there's data at all levels, all around us, coming at us, transactionally, operationally, impact data. And it's almost as if data-driven would mean that we would be intent about picking that data, whereas data-informed to me means we're creating a more comprehensive picture all the time to inform our decision-making. And I think that's actually a more dynamic and realistic future. But it's not, I believe, where we are yet as a community of social sector government practitioners.
Other thoughts on that?
I was just thinking I was talking to a policymaker a couple months ago about a bill, and it was interesting that, not to go into specifics, but it was just kind of just this informal conversation.
Our system will end this conference in 5 minutes. To extend this call for 1 hour, please enter the moderator PIN now.
I got 5 minutes, I'm gonna talk really fast.
You know that pin, Derek.
But so we were talking about how that vote went, and they were talking about data, and his explanation was one side presented a lot of evidence and data, and nobody from the other side who would have benefited from the passing of the bill presented anything. And so us as policymakers, we're not the experts on all of these things. We can't be. But we didn't get the full picture from every piece, all of the evidence, all of the data that could have been presented, and so a lot of us just didn't feel comfortable moving forward. So I think being data informed really requires an evidence informed, meaning we have to have a complete picture before we should be making decisions that we're not 100% sure may be the right thing, whatever that may be.
You know, I can imagine one issue is how do you frame it for the people who have the interest? And so for practitioners that have been the traditional experts, rather than framing it as, well, the data say one thing, you say another, we're going to go with the data. First of all, there's the possibility and the likelihood that they say the same thing, and then it's great for the practitioners to be confirmed by the data. And when there's a disagreement or a misalignment, it should be a conversation about, well, what do we think is going on here, as opposed to a horse race between one data source and another data source. So. An issue that's already come up that I want to press on a little bit more is culture and changing culture and helping organizations adopt a data-informed approach. What are some of the approaches to driving culture that you've seen be successful or at least hold promise in your experience? And to the degree you've seen it, what are some efforts that you've seen fail to drive culture? Connor, can we start with you on that topic?
Yeah, I'm just going to throw out investment in people. I think we've invested a lot in human capital and getting people up to not bringing in new people necessarily, but investing in getting people to understand the value of doing things differently than we did yesterday, and making sure that they're on board and that we're building consensus and understanding of why we're moving in a certain direction, and letting everybody have a voice at the table to say what that roadmap should be and how we get there. And it goes back to kind of what I was talking about with the vision and mission and values, really socializing that and then connecting to the purpose, and then talking about how data, technology, process, and people can get us to that end goal. And so starting off with a small group, we went from 0 to 6 or 7 data scientists in our agency over the last 12 months. What is an agency who's primarily responsible for Medicaid and SNAP and TANF going to do with data scientists? Mm-hmm. Well, we have to start taking these people and getting them to really show the value of how we can do things different than just reporting, and we can really enhance business intelligence and advanced analytics to do things more efficiently while investing in the professional development of current resources as well, so that everybody kind of sees where we can go.
I won't name which state this is because this is one of the more failed examples, but I was talking to a state recently and they have multiple agencies in their department, I think like 4, and they're all incredibly siloed historically. And so the new commissioner came in and he said, okay, well, you know, it's interesting you guys are really siloed, but we have the master client index. So technically we could be wrapping all of these services around people and we could be tracking which clients are in which program, and it's not happening. So we're integrating all of our data, you know, we're changing how we're doing business. And for example, he brought in the 4 agency leads into the same room to talk about this stuff, and they looked at each other and they were like, "Oh, this is interesting. We've never been in the same room together before, never." And so, but then at the same time, he's getting a lot of pushback from people in middle management because this is not something that they've ever done before, and now you're telling them to change everything. And the implicit assumption there is if you're changing everything you were doing before was wrong. So you're telling people that what they've been doing is wrong. And so I think it's important to do what Connor said, is socializing these ideas and making people a part of the visioning process and taking them along on the journey with you. And that takes time. Like I think it's like a year or 2 years or something like that until you get people to sign on to this new vision of integration. So that's something I would recommend too, just thinking very long term in this stuff.
And I would say, and we had this conversation earlier, in that scenario, somebody has to lead. You have to hire someone, or someone at your organization has to be the person that's going to lead the facilitation processes that it takes to bring all these various teams, people, mindsets together. And usually that person is the technical person, the chief data person, the chief information or technology person, the chief evaluation officer. Some chief of some sort has to lead, but it's usually the one with the technical expertise. And what I've seen is, in the most successful cases, the lead is actually the soft skill person. It's the person that can spend the time setting up these facilitation processes and that has the patience and not another day job of probably answering to some of the fires that are coming through the government offices of some sort. And that's not intuitive. It's not intuitive that changing your data culture is not going to be your chief data officer. And I think that is something that we've come to grips with. I've seen it in the evaluation space, and I'm seeing it also in the data space.
Lars, did you have thoughts on culture?
Nothing terribly different than what's already been said. And I think you hit on it with your comment right before on this tension between, you step into an organization saying, well, we're going to start bringing data to bear on this, and the folks who have the experience feel, maybe not attacked, but, they're certainly defensive because it's, the robot's coming to replace us type deal. But just to echo what everyone said, I mean, I think it's how do you continue to show people that they have value, that experience and expertise is certainly something that is still valued and has a place in where we're going as an organization. And as Veronica was saying, it's not rocket science. It is you have to have people that can talk to people, that can bring them along, have those soft skills, and that aren't just going to try to run roughshod over folks.
I think you have to I think success for like a data-driven culture or culture of inquiry is you have created the successful AntiHippo. Does anybody know what the hippo is? So it's the highest paid person's opinion. So when the hippo in your organization, your agency has now used data for their opinions and decisions too, I think you've finally gotten to a point where everyone within the organization is considering data at some level before they make a decision. So I'm sure everybody has somebody where they're like, you're welcome when you get back to work tomorrow.
Another source of tension is, at least theoretically, a competition for resources. And so to be more data-driven, our organization needs to make investments in data infrastructure and new policies and practices. And there's a thought that those resources may detract from providing services at a level that would be desired. And so they're seen as a competition for resources. And as someone who sits on the board of a few nonprofits, I see this all the time in terms of how focus is every dollar needs to go to services. And so the issue about investing in data gets wrapped up in that. So how do we address that issue? How do we communicate about setting the right priority for data in a space where that's a concern about competition for resources?
I think I was actually just having a conversation with someone last week about this very thing, and we were talking about how we kind of oscillate between keeping the lights on and what we have to do to keep the lights on, and then realizing that we have to do these things where we innovate, where we do better, where we modernize, where we strive for excellence and do things different than we're doing just to keep the lights on so we can improve on the way we're doing that. And that's hard because you do start competing for resources when you have to make a decision on a go live for a major system and stopping activities over here that are going to potentially use data more effectively so that in the future we are actually using less resources to get better outcomes. So I think you have to remember why we're here, right? Connect to purpose and go back and look at that vision statement. And the vision statement does actually remind us that just keeping the lights on isn't going to let us accomplish what we're here to do. And so we have to make sure that we separate the two and continue these activities. Otherwise, we'll never.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge to a lot of this work is the status quo. And that's honestly where we spend a lot of our time on when we go into a city. It's, folks know how things have worked in the past. Most cities, their budget process is what was last year and do we make an incremental enhancement or adjustment based on what we think the revenue will be. I've actually been really, I'm not a budget person and this was not super exciting to me until I got into the weeds on it. And so there's this is what eventually some of my work became, outcomes-based budgeting. I don't know if folks have heard of this before, like priority-based budgeting, but I think it goes back to exactly what Connor was saying is, it's can you put in place, I think the only way any of this stuff is sustainable is if you put in processes that have buy-in and agreement and that are repeatable over time. And this is just as an example of this, an idea that, what we did last year or 2 years ago doesn't matter. Right? What we funded you at last year doesn't matter. What are our priorities as an organization? What are the outcomes that we want to see? And oh, by the way, now you can submit a budget supported by data, supported by conversations with people in the community, a budget request. And maybe it's not just the police department that's now focused on our public safety outcome. Maybe it's the police department and the Parks and Rec, and they want to go in on an opportunity. And so I think, to the extent that we can kind of shake up the status quo and get folks thinking about what are those outcomes and priorities we want to see, then you see both the service and the programmatic piece come into alignment and conversation, hopefully, with the folks that are building and running the data infrastructure within the organization.
And I would just add, I think, making the value proposition clear, I think is important. But at the end of the day, and someone and an organization that looks at many people's budgeting plans through our investor lens, you still have to make an investment. And I think it's close to something you were saying. There's this linearity that we automatically assume, and we think, okay, we're going to budget this much for the program and this much for the people, and then there's this other thing called the data, right? We have to get the data, whether it's evaluation, whether it's research, whether it's like this bucket of things. And I think, and then when you start to look at that really transactionally, it's like sticker shock, like why do we have to spend that much? And it is taking away from doing the real work, the program work. And I almost think our mindsets just have to shift in that it shouldn't just be this linear other bucket. It's something that should permeate all of your work. It in fact is programmatic in nature, knowing how your clients or your end users feel or think, or data that says something about that outcome and impact is not just this other adjacent bucket. It is something that's core to your mandate and that needs to be weaved in to it as an expense. We also spend a lot of time thinking about this and working with a lot of impact investors and social enterprises and those that are optimizing for financial performance and at the same time optimizing for social performance. And we have this conversation back and forth around, it's easy for me to track my financial performance because I'm already managing my finance. It's really difficult for me to track my social performance because that feels like an add-on. And we are often making the case around, well, no, actually, you're trying to manage your impact. And in order to manage your impact, you've got to make investments in the same way that you would make an investment in your financial performance system. And I think that changing that mindset and really thinking about it differently as to the very tactical budgeting process, I think is really key to changing our culture.
I have one good state example around that. You described that really well, where the state sort of justified investing in this integrated and interoperable IT infrastructure because if you're sending your customers to go and apply to SNAP and then apply to all these other programs, the state was saying you're kind of re-traumatizing them every single time because you keep making them prove that they're poor. And so I thought that was kind of interesting to think about, to actually really think about your customers' well-being in that way, and to weave that into your thinking for purchasing a better data infrastructure.
Veronica, you brought up an important issue in terms of this, what I'll call compartmentalization of where this capability is in an organization. That sometimes it can be treated as, we've got this asset, it's off to the side, we'll go use it when we need it, but it's not really central to the mission necessarily, or it's not treated that way. Are there strategies to break that down, to drive the integration of the data capabilities right to the mission and to the core vision and values of an organization?
Sure. And we've talked a little bit about some of the strategies, from ensuring that the data team is not necessarily off to the side. I also think about the linearity of the way that we think about when data analysis happens, and really the concept of data use. Data use in the decision-making cycle happens at some point in time, and the decision makers are making decisions all the time, not at that one moment in time. It's really about thinking, number one, how that is centrally positioned at your organization, and number two, making sure that your policies are in place to allow for your other teams, your programmatic teams, to have access to that capability. We talked a little bit about this earlier from the evaluation perspective. In government, as many of you know, did I drop something? No, you didn't. In government, as many of you know, the value of data is also it comes with how independent it is, how confident you are in the data, and you usually have those people in some other office way, way over there. But the decisions are happening every day in Congress way, way over here. And you're just not getting the timely data that you need. You're not using the data that you have either internally or really far away. And so I feel like the nut to crack is really, how do we get that capacity, whether it's from a measurement point of view, from a data analytics point of view, to the table as the programs are being designed? How do you ask those questions around why are we doing this and what is the purpose of that data from the very beginning, and not as something that happens as either a retrospective or as an afterthought or somewhere in some other environment?
Any other thoughts on that, on how to break down those walls?
I think investment in a data governance strategy is really important. I'm stealing this from somebody else. I can't take credit for this, but they said data is like a 5-year-old at the zoo. It will go wherever it wants, unless you tell it where not to go. And when they said that, I thought about they have the leash with the kid, and that's what I was like envisioning. That's data, right? So unless you create a data governance strategy and program that actually it helps create the parameters and rules and structure about how we use data and how we make decisions with data, what we can do with it, who can do what with what information, when, under what circumstances, and with what methods, right? So it actually starts it actually makes it easier to get access to data because people stop saying no to things because they're uncomfortable with making that decision. There's more transparency, and it's clear to people why and how we're making the decisions. So I think by putting that in place, it actually kind of frees everything up to move where we want it to go, to be more effective with how we make the decisions and how we use the data.
Speaking of governance, obviously governance goes beyond just having memorandum of understanding or data sharing agreements. And this came up a lot in the questions that were submitted by audience members ahead of time of the session about how can we, what are the best practices that we've identified for driving more active data sharing? How can we get more data sharing among partners in order to be able to leverage the advantage of integrating data? So my question is both, what are the best practices that you've seen around driving success and data sharing, getting people to share more actively? And two, what are the success stories you can tell about accomplishments once that happens?
One example from a state that I really liked is that they really emphasized bringing in a lot of people from the very beginning. When you know you're trying to share data, or you've got this use case, so they said to make sure you bring in business and IT people, and we've talked about why, but also to bring in your attorneys from the very beginning so that they can buy into your goal and your mission and what you're trying to accomplish. So instead of like dumping an agreement on their table and saying we're doing something crazy, new and innovative and sign off on this, their answer is going to be no. If they're in the room from the very beginning and understanding where you're trying to go and they've been part of the conversations. There's one state that just told me that they did that and they had their attorneys in the room from the very beginning and they signed off on something that they might not otherwise have signed off on. So I like that.
Indiana, we, I guess this is a success story, but we have the Management Performance Hub, which is an agency that was created, and the Chief Data Officer for the state, Darshan Shah, oversees the agency and has been a key asset in liberating data or promoting data sharing. We do have some state laws that have enabled that agency, and the whole purpose of it is to essentially improve cross-sector data sharing across the agencies to improve efficiency in state government. And through our work with them, we have been able to get pretty close to yes and on sharing 42 CFR Part 2 substance use disorder data across a couple of different agencies to do some evaluation activities with substance use disorder, which all the states are struggling with this. It's very complicated regulations, but through a lot of legal work between their general counsel and our general counsel, and we all wanted to get to yes because it's an important evaluation to do. We just have to work through the legal piece under the evaluation and audit exception for 42 CFR Part 2. But then I'll reiterate again that we got to yes on the legal piece. We think we're okay with that given the structure of our agencies and how we think we can make it work within the law. But the answer is, so we got to yes, now what? And that goes back to the data governance piece. There's still so many processes and protocols that we have to write down to make sure that everyone is protected and we're doing it the right way. And that's the what information do you actually need? How are you going to get it? How are we going to share it? Where is it going to? So it's the operational piece. I found the legal piece seems to be easier these days, at least if you have if you have enough lawyer friends, it becomes a little bit easier.
Yeah, I think, we talked about this a little bit on some of the planning calls. Having just that shared values, shared outcomes, that maybe, one agency over here, you all have been in your silos, but really at the end of the day, you have the same goals and outcomes. And so on the one hand, it takes a strong leader to bring those, to insist that, hey, we need to meet. We all work for the same state with the same goals, and we haven't met. And so I think that's one piece there. I will say, just thinking about success examples, and I don't remember all the exact numbers. So as part of the policing work we did at the White House, we also did a lot of work on criminal justice reform, but also we launched this work. It was called the DataDriven Justice Initiative, and now it's still run by my colleague, former colleague Lynn Overman at Arnold Ventures, from our Lauren John Arnold Foundation. But the crux of that was, how do you drive down jail utilization in counties? On the one hand, we know that most of the folks who are going in and out of these jails are the same, like, let's just say 70% of folks, on a monthly, maybe annual basis, just cycling in and out. So on the one hand, you have the police officers who are picking up these guys for usually minor violations, putting them in jail. But on the other hand, these are the same guys who are showing up in hospitals who we have and understand that they have really serious mental health, substance abuse issues that we should be treating over here as opposed to just throwing them in jail. For us, it's real common sense. Like, well, okay, when we pick an individual up, like, we should have information about how many times it's been picked up previously, what are the issues do we know about him or her, and maybe it's not the best thing to go throw them in a cell with 20 other folks, and we should take them over to this other service provider. It's common sense stuff, and you all have seen, the common sense does not always lead to the best outcomes. Miami-Dade County did this really successfully, drove down jail utilization, was able to close, I believe, at least a couple jails there. And so part of the work that we were trying to do, and my colleagues at the White House at the time, were to really focus and try to bring folks together to get up some standard language for how you can share some of this data. You certainly run into kind of real policy and legal roadblocks at times. But the other thing you discover is a lot of times the things that we have conditioned ourselves to believe are legal roadblocks or policy roadblocks, once you get into, when you asked a few questions, okay, well, show me where that is in paper or in writing that says you can't share that with me. Well, oh, such and such said that. That's what I heard from such and such years ago, right? And so just having those conversations can start to drive down some of those things. And then, you know, to your point, you do need to start at some point, maybe a little bit more innovative around how you share, or, you know, maybe it requires legislative action or something like that.
And I would only add that, you know, something that we've done really to live this out in practice is partnered really closely. So we, being the evaluation team, the measurement and evaluation team, partner really closely with our data and our tech team at the very beginning of any big programmatic investment of some sort. And the way that we see our roles and responsibilities is that the evaluation and the measurement team helps teams, others, the decision makers, facilitate the what and the when and the why of why we're even going to be doing the work, so that we can match the data and the measurement piece to it. And the data people come and they start to think about the how. How do we actually get the data that we're going to need to be able to do all of this? And it requires a lot of foresight. And I think coming from the evaluation space, Paul, you might relate to this. It just feels as if many of these activities that used to be an end of term type of activity has become first and foremost part of the planning, of the design work. And I think parsing out these responsibilities has really helped every one of us come to the table with something to add, and really increase our organizational muscle to be able to then downstream do this type of analysis and service to decision making.
Many of the organizations that start their way down this road of being data enhanced, they like to start with the data that they're already on hand. And that might be a good instinct. But how can we also get them thinking about the data that they need or that they could use to gain even more insight? How can you turn that curiosity that Clarence talked about into hard thinking about data to answer the critical questions they have in the long run?
Sure. Well, I have a bias towards at least starting with the data that you have in what I would call your sphere of control. I do think that data use, and really the question that you're answering with when I say data use, is not the so what. You're asking the now what. All right, so now you have this data. What are you going to do with it? And it's a really interesting exercise to at least start with the data that you have in your sphere of control. Because once you get out and you start to collect data out there, which talks about your outcomes and your impacts and all the really great stuff that we all like to get into, you get it gets very complex very fast. And without some type of data or measurement strategy to controlling all of the data, it could become a very costly exercise. And so at least building that internal muscle internally to start with your own transactional operational data, I think is really critical to then starting the journey of the data out there.
Because I agree wholeheartedly with her, I'm going to play devil's advocate.
Yay.
Because that's fun, right? So I agree with everything she just said. And I was talking to Chief Data Officer of Vermont, and their recommendation to us was to make sure that you start with data cataloging of what you have, because to do good data governance, you have to know what you have first and foremost. But the devil's advocate piece, if we spend, because I've seen this happen too, if we spend too much time looking at just what's in our sphere of control, right, we start to run into we get so myopic and we forget about all the other data that is right here too. It's just in another unit, another division. Everything is data, right? As we're walking, we're all wearing personal, Fitbits or whatever, and it's tracking data. Everything we do is generating data. And I think the true data innovators are those who see that and realize that and can go say, oh, but wait, if we're trying to answer this question, I see what I have here. But I also know that this other group is collecting something, and now I'm going to use that data for something it's never been intended for, but it's there, right? So we have to balance invest in looking at what's in front of you and make sure you truly understand that and maximize the use of it. But then also don't create the silo where we're not using all this other stuff that's relevant to that analysis, evaluation, question, whatever it may be.
Agree with both those statements. My only caution there is, and I have felt this viscerally in the work that I've done with police departments, is being cautious of sometimes, because you're right, it's harder to go get the rest of that data that's out there, right? That you might need to answer some of your questions, and so I've seen it where we take what's in our sphere of influence, we take what we have, and we try to answer the questions from that. My only word of caution is just like a lot of times that data may be very good data, but like even the decision on what to collect or what not to collect was informed by very political choices. And I always get concerned, right, when we start with what we have as opposed to like what do we need, and even if we ultimately end up back at what we have as a first pass on it, but just at least being clear that we're using this data because of these reasons, right?
And the only thing I'd add here is I can tell I'm not a data person because I keep going back to the human-centered design pieces and just talking to people. Like it's like, don't look at the numbers, just talk to people. But I would say if you're really trying to figure something out and you think that maybe you're thinking too siloed about it, I would always go back to your frontline staff and ask them, what is it that you're seeing? What is it that you think might be the case? What are some trends that you think are out there that we could maybe address upstream, or if we're trying to be preventative? What do you think we could do? And then if you can collect their questions, you see what kind of data you would need to answer those questions. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I would just say you have your human capital, your resources there too, and if you just ask them what is it that they need, I think they'll give you a surprising amount of variety, and I think you'll realize what kind of data sources you might have to start looking into as well.
When I came into this job too, I have a mentoring colleague that always asks me the question, to do what? Sometimes it can be so frustrating, but he's usually right, that I wanted to go get this data, I wanted to go get that data, I want to go pull this in, and that's all costly, right? So the question was always, they weren't saying no, they were just saying, to do what? Like, what are you really trying to do? Well, what question are you trying to answer? Think about it critically before you just go start pulling all this stuff that may not help at all in what you're trying to do. So we kind of jump the gun sometimes, and I don't think we miss that. I mean, when you're doing grants or when you're putting together, or when you're procuring something or you're going to do some evaluation, we don't think about, we're going to do something different with claims, or we're going to provide reimbursement for community health workers, which we've never done before, but the state is not doing that. We wanted to evaluate that, but we didn't think about how we needed to get data to be able to do that evaluation until the back end. So this question of to do what do we really want to do? What's the outcome here? How do we make sure we set ourselves up for success and don't just go pull things just because it's our gut reaction, but think about it and be purposeful about what we're doing.
What they call the why.
Yeah.
Last question before we open up to the audience. When I'm talking about, and Veronica, I'll address this to you. We'll see if others have comments as well. When I'm talking about these issues outside Mathematica, and I'm talking about how data get used in a public management sphere, and the data science and democratization of data and the introduction of new technologies, I always say this is a long game that we're starting, and we're in the first half of the first inning. Is that a fair comment in your mind? How do you see kind of how long this process is likely to play out, and how will I know when I've reached the destination? What is the destination?
Those are big questions, Paul. In terms of the timing, yes, I agree. We had this conversation earlier, and back to my earlier point around how we would define data-driven. I do think that we spend a lot more time talking about the theory of being data-driven than actually driving decision-making via data. And so I think that this is a long game, but I also think that this is one of the greatest challenges that we have to figure out now. Perhaps we didn't have the tools to figure it out really in the past. But now, with the use of data science and machine learning and all those wonderful, innovative things that we talk about, including artificial intelligence, we can problem solve our way through the amount of data in different and innovative ways. And so I think that while it's a longer game, I don't necessarily believe that it's a long game that will never be solved. I also see it as a very dynamic process. And I think back to the earlier point around starting with the data that you have. I think for me, we're not using the data that exists. And a really good point is around evaluations and them just sitting on these dusted shelves and nobody using the data. I don't think the problem is the evaluation, although I will say yes, sometimes it is. I think the problem is actually behaving and having the habits that we need to be answering the so what and now what questions, using data versus instinct. Decisions will be made all the time. We all see it. We experience them from day to day, and they're not based on data. And so unless we're very much feeling and are used to making those decisions, I don't think the tool or the data in itself is what's going to solve it. And I think that acknowledgement is staring at us in the here and the now.
I don't have a ton more to add. I think other than I agree. It's been. I do think. I mean, we're starting to enter the phase of. Early on, if I think back, just even 6-7 years ago, it's like open data this, open data that. Like, how can we open up more data sets, democratize more data sets? And in part, I think there's just that was in many ways low hanging fruit. Like, it's figure out what we have, can we share it or not, and businesses will bloom, people will do research, they'll build apps, they'll serve people better. But I think even now, like, we've reached a point where, some of that's happened, a lot of it hasn't, and so now people are asking, tougher questions on like, okay, well, why do you want this, why do you want this open up? Or the next level of like, okay, now that the data's out there, what are we going to do with that? I also think that, as I think back, like we were ignorant of a lot of things, even like 7-8 years ago. I think like privacy has become more of a central, where we thought that like data and these new technologies and systems would like make our lives so much better. I mean, if you bring up smart cities right now, just as a phrase, right, 5-6 years ago, oh, we can, the cities will transform. We can have everything at our beck and call. And now you bring it up, you'll get eye rolls, just derisiveness around this, because I think we all have a better understanding of a little bit around the privacy implications. A lot of the private sector companies who are taking the smart cities data and selling it back to advertisers, et cetera. So I think, there's this oscillation here where we'll get smart on some things. We'll discover a new challenge, try to solve that. Some of the things that we think now, we'll look back on and laugh 5-6 years from now. So yeah, it's constantly moving target, but
I want to move to the audience before the time gets away from us.
That's a very big topic that we could spend a lot of time talking about, and I'm happy to do so. I would say the one piece that I think is often overlooked in all of the legal and data agreements and all the conversations around who's collecting what as data is moving from one hand to the other all the way up, is the end user data. And I think one of the things that I've been experimenting about, and Christine will like this comment, is just cutting to the chase. We live in a world where finance for social sector and development decision making happens all the time from far, far away from where the work is actually happening. As an investor and as a responsible investor, for me, I'd like to make sure that we are actually hearing the authentic story. And the only way to do that is to actually just go to the end user, not to go to the reports. And so I've been experimenting a lot with mobile data collection, either like lean data collection or IVR, because what I'm prioritizing is feedback from the end user client. Like, did you actually get your services? Did you do something? Were they useful? And do you have a sense of whether or not it's changing your life? And we're finding really interesting things in these micro surveys that we're doing, collecting feedback. We would have assumed, of course they did, and of course it is. And yeah, their lives are changed, and therefore we have impact. And what we're finding are things like they never received services. And we're finding our hypotheses are being invalidated, and it's equipping us with the ability to make different decisions in a timelier way versus waiting for that report that has come in third, sometimes fourth hand from the field.
That is a big challenge. And so I was talking to Veronica earlier about this, and so coming from academia, and I kept saying that I'm not an IT person by training. I'm not a computer scientist. I didn't come from the IT background. But there's this continuum that I noticed when I came in of IT solutions and business solutions, and we were very, very heavy on everything we did. It's very IT centric. The solutions were very security heavy. They were designed to make life easier for IT. They didn't really take into account what business actually needed to do with these solutions. So what I wanted to try to do is move that somewhere to the middle where we balance privacy, security, cybersecurity, all the things that we need to do to make IT operate correctly, but then also make sure it was more accessible and transparent to business so it was useful to them. And so some things that we've tried to do is we've tried to embed people. Before I came to the agency, we kind of centralized data and IT. For our Medicaid team, for example, we now have 6 or 7 data people who are physically located over in Medicaid, a business analyst, a couple data analysts and developers, project managers, to really be there to better understand what Medicaid does, what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, why they're asking for this data, and trying to socialize the IT and data staff to the purpose of why we're here, to deliver Medicaid, to deliver SNAP, to deliver these social services. So when we get a request for data, a report, a dashboard, something, our IT and data people are really good, right? And they will deliver exactly the way it was asked. Unfortunately, sometimes we have to ask, what are you really trying to do? What's the end goal here? What question are you trying to ask? And really understand the request up front before we go do it. And so I've been pushing everybody to really sit down with business. And it's a two-way street. Business has to invest the time with data, the data analytics team. And it may be frustrating for them because I don't think we always truly understand what is the reimbursement team doing? What is the program integrity team doing? Why are they asking for this? Well, once you understand why they're trying to do it, sometimes you can tailor the solution and say, oh, you don't really want what you asked for. You want this because this is how the claim flows. So you can't do it that way, but we can do it this way, and that gets to your needs. So I think really getting both business to invest in spending time with data to explain why they're doing things and having data take the time to better understand the purpose of the ask has been helpful.
And I would just add, getting just not your data people, everybody else, having them take some kind of course on data science, I think is really important because something that we've started seeing is, yes, we want to have dashboards that look like the New York Times. And we want them to be dynamic. And so it goes back to that linearity piece. It's like you do all your work and then you go with your data to the data people and they make a really great visualization. And then you go back, but your visualization is probably one input into a more complex decision-making cycle. Wouldn't it be great if your non-data people, could make their own visualizations? Wouldn't it be great if they had the skill sets to use R or Python or all the really great statistical and data science types of analytical packages? And it's not that hard anymore. And so I think it's very much about mainstreaming that muscle across and still having the expertise.
Yeah, and I think it's an ongoing process, to be honest, because I was talking to a really advanced Medicaid agency recently, and they were talking about, okay, so we met with our policy team, and they wanted to cut down on the number of prescribed opioids, right, and these pill mills. And so that policy was put in place, and that happened, and so fewer opioids were prescribed, but then everybody got shifted to the black market instead and got their pills there instead. And so now, part of that was him, the person I was talking to, he was saying we had to learn to also ask policy teams what negative consequences they wanted to avoid. So, fewer ER visits or that people don't end up in the criminal justice system instead. And so I think it is a two-way street, right, to understand that everybody's learning. And I agree with you. I think it's a great idea to also invest in staff training because, some of that dashboarding isn't that difficult anymore. You can do it as a caseworker, but some of the more complicated stuff is definitely a two-way street, and it's going to take a while to get right.
This issue comes up as a big issue at every data science conference I've ever attended. And usually there's some, one of the most experienced people in the room who declares to the younger people in the room, the most important thing you can do in your career is engage with the business. It's probably somebody's hippo. And so but I agree, it takes time. It's an ongoing process.
I've seen and that's why I said it's a two-way street. I've seen some, just give me this, right? I've heard that from business before, where it's not a just, guys. Like, we need to define what you're actually trying to do, because your just doesn't make sense to me. It may make sense to you, but if I don't I need you to sit down and talk to me, and then they see, and then they're like, oh my God, you guys got it right the first time. I'll sit down with you every time, because this made it easier, because you got it, the first or second time, instead of took so many iterations to not deliver what they were looking for. So.
I'll just say first about some resources. So through What Works Cities, we work with 5 partner organizations. I sit at Results for America, Johns Hopkins University, the Government Excellence Center, Harvard Kennedy School Government Performance Lab, Behavioral Insights Team, North American Sunlight Foundation in DC. Through the What Works Cities initiative, all of those organizations are producing and are required to produce resources for cities, but it's also applicable for broadly to other types of organizations. So on the data governance piece in particular, I know that GovX has some policies and examples online if you were to check out their site. Hopkins, and I'm looking over at you as though you. There you go.
I'll say the Data Governance Institute, but I also do a shameless plug for APHSA. So we're the analytics committee. We're working on actually doing some of this, pulling some resources together around data governance and defining the value proposition for enhanced data governance to achieve population health analytics. And so we're in this process, and I think I'm happy to share with Mathematica some links and resources that maybe you guys can make available to people. But also, Actionable Insight for Social Policy has some good resources on their website about data sharing and data governance policies as well.
Yeah, AISP is great. Would definitely recommend going to AISP. I also would recommend the California Data Playbook. You just Google that, it'll come up. It's the California Health and Human Services Agency's strategic playbook for how they use data. And they've got visualizations, they've got videos, they've got their strategic plays, and it's written for analysts and for policymakers, so it's easy to understand for people like me. So I think that's really useful. And then if you want to get a little bit more techie, the Allegheny Analytics, Allegheny County Analytics, I think that's just the name of their website. Allegheny County has done a lot of visualizations of their data, and they always push everything out there because they want everybody to steal their stuff and copy what they're doing. So if you haven't seen that website, I would recommend that as well.
And our data asset policy is available online, Meredith, and I'm happy to share it with you, knowing specifically that Packard is a philanthropy, so it might be a little bit of a different animal than a government administration body.
Okay. Hi, my name is Ladd Colston. I'm with Sustainable Visions. We're just a small minority-owned business on the eastern shore of Maryland. And very interesting dialogue here with different perspectives. But I didn't hear the word needs assessment. And I was just wondering whether needs assessment is an area, a baseline, if you will, that is used to actually be used to define not only your priorities, but the data that will help to reach the outcomes for those priorities. And then I'm a logic model kind of guy, to kind of go back and say, hey, we have reached this outcome. Now we can move on to the next priority, but also let that population know that that outcome has been achieved, and then watch it work. So I'm just going to throw that out.
Happy to weigh in. Sure. Does anyone else? I would say that, yes, we can do a needs assessment, and I think it's one tool that can be used to gather information about, the population or your client base that then could feed into a broader data and measurement strategy. I would only say there that I think this moment in time is very different from back in the day, because as an evaluator, and you might relate to this, The needs assessment or the logic modeling or all those various tools would come when the evaluation would come, and that would come at the end or somewhere further down the line, not when all the decisions around budgeting and planning had been made. And I think what's different about this moment in time and what this data challenge is bringing to the table is being able to have those types of conversations and apply that type of data collection and inquiry at the beginning, so that you can actually align your budgeting and your planning and your talent and your people so that it's all set up so that when you do have the moment of having data, you can make the right decisions and you set yourself up for success.
Yeah, I didn't use the word needs assessment. I think a lot of the themes that we were talking about, though, in terms of how you set your priorities early on, conversations that you're having with frontline users of your service, I think are very much in line with that.
Let me give everybody on the panel one final shot, which is a shot to give the audience, share with the audience, one tangible action you think anybody can take to advance their journey to becoming more data informed in these processes.
Yeah, I'm going to make it very short and sweet, so you don't have very much time to think about this. I would say just jump in, right? So we can spend a lot of time asking the questions and trying to analyze everything from, in any possible way till we feel comfortable doing something. But I think if you start asking the question, what bad happens if we try this? And if the answer is nothing, like we didn't waste a lot of money, we didn't put anybody at risk, so what? Let's try it. Then I think you can start working on things and start to actually see if things are working out. For example, we implemented Health Leads questions in our application. So there are 10 questions that are written at a 5th grade level to ask people about food insecurity, basic social determinants of health questions. And we just added that onto the application for SNAP, TANF, and Medicaid to start collecting data. The answer to the question was nothing bad happens if we collect the information. We still don't know yet how useful it will be, but we were spending so much time talking about, well, we can get information from IHCDA, which is our housing authority. We could get data from here. And it was taking, so we just jumped in. Nothing bad happens from trying this. And we've actually made a lot of progress just from over the last 10 months by just jumping in 2 feet.
I guess what I would say is reach out to people across state lines, smart people like Connor who've thought through all of this already. This is Christina going on the record, not APHSA, I would say every human services agency in the country right now is doing some very strategic thinking and doing around data and analytics. We might only be hearing from the same 5 or 6, but everyone is doing something around this. So I promise that you've got lots of contacts and people out there that could help walk you through this. And if you're a human services agency, we're your association, and we can help make those links. So feel free to send me an email.
I just say start small, try to make it fun. I don't know where everybody's at or situated in their organization. What's a small experiment that you could do? Something you've been curious about in your organization. If you have a team, put the challenge out to them. What's a question that you have about the work that we do that you don't think that we've sufficiently answered yet? So, I say like small scale experiments or small pilots, something that takes a little bit of the pressure off. We're going to do something for a certain amount of time. How are we going to evaluate whether or not we were successful or not, and whether or not we should continue to do it? So yeah, I'd say, to the extent you can, make it fun.
And I would say, believe that we are all responsible for getting up to speed on being data savvy. And that it is our imperative because the stronger we all are, the better we can do our work and generate the types of impacts that we've been talking about for, I would say, the last 70 years. So change the mindset.
That's great. And I want to thank everyone in the audience for participating, and please join me in thanking all the members of the panel for their incredible work.